What was it like when you found it, though?
I was making the tea at the time. This big shout goes up. Richard, who found it, was holding it up. Oh my goodness me, you found a dodecahedron. I've only read about those. I've never seen one. And every work just stops.
Archaeologists have pulled more than 130 of these mysterious bronze objects from the ground across Europe, and not one person in 2,000 years has been able to explain what they are. Every single expert, every single theory, every single attempt to solve this puzzle has collapsed, and the silence surrounding them in every Roman record ever discovered is not an accident. Something about the Roman dodecahedron is freaking historians out. Roman dodecahedrons have been found all over Europe, and nobody knows for sure how they were made. The craftsmanship music that it would take to make a bronze Roman dodecahedron would have been very challenging for a metal artisan to make at the time. And when modern science finally looked inside one, what it found was so unexpected that it rewrote everything. What was Rome hiding? And why does this object still have no explanation? Join us as we uncover what the Roman dodecahedron was really used for. The Roman object nobody could explain. Somewhere in a museum display case, sitting behind glass like any ordinary artifact, is an object that has defeated every expert who has ever studied it. And the moment you see it, you understand why. It is made of bronze, hollow at its center, and shaped into a 12-sided geometric form, with each of its faces pierced by a circular hole, though no two holes share the same diameter. At every point where the faces meet, a small rounded knob protrudes outward, 20 of them in total, sitting perfectly at each corner of the structure. It is, without question, one of the most precisely engineered objects to survive from the ancient world. Archaeologists call it the Roman dodecahedron, and more than 130 examples have been pulled from the soil across Europe, from the edges of Britain all the way to the forests of Germania. Each one slightly different. Each one unmistakably the same, and not one of them has ever been satisfactorily explained. Here is the problem. Rome was an empire that wrote everything down, recording its aqueducts and its battles and its merchant transactions right down to the weight of individual coins. Yet across every surviving text, every mural, and every official archive left behind by one of history's most literate civilizations, there is not a single mention of this object, not one word, not one drawing, nothing. An empire obsessed with recording everything chose to say nothing about an object its people clearly crafted, handled, and buried with intention. And that silence is not an accident. When researchers finally placed these objects inside a modern laboratory and ran the analysis, what they found inside them would suggest that the silence was deliberate and very carefully maintained. Built with advanced engineering. The moment you hold a Roman dodecahedron in your hands, something becomes immediately clear. And that is that whoever made this object knew exactly what they were doing. Because this was not the work of an amateur or a simple craftsman following basic instructions, but the product of someone with a deep and sophisticated understanding of metalwork, geometry, and precision manufacturing. The dodecahedrons were made using a process called lost wax casting, which was one of the most technically demanding metalworking techniques available in the ancient world, requiring the craftsman to first sculpt the object in wax, coat it in clay, heat the mold until the wax melted away, and then pour molten bronze into the hollow space left behind. A process that demanded patience, skill, and a thorough understanding of how metals behave under extreme heat. The bronze itself was of high quality, and the production costs would have been significant, meaning these were not cheap objects thrown together for everyday use, but carefully and deliberately manufactured items that someone considered worth investing serious time and resources into creating. And yet, here is where things start to become strange, because Roman tools and manufactured goods were almost always standardized, marked with measurements, built to consistent ratios, and designed to be replicated identically across the empire. In the same way that Roman bricks, Roman roads, and Roman military equipment followed strict universal specifications that allowed them to be produced anywhere and used interchangeably. The dodecahedrons follow none of those rules. No two examples share the same dimensions. No two have holes of identical sizes. No two follow a consistent ratio between their faces and their openings. And none of them carry any official Roman markings, stamps, or inscriptions of any kind, which is deeply unusual for an object that clearly required skilled labor and expensive materials to produce. If Rome had invented these objects and used them for an official purpose, there would be a standard version, a consistent design, a repeatable template that workshops across the empire could follow. And there would almost certainly be some kind of record acknowledging their existence and function. These objects were not produced by Roman imperial industry, and the question of who actually made them and why begins with a single excavation in the English countryside that would leave archaeologists completely lost for answers. The discovery beneath Lincolnshire. In a quiet field in Lincolnshire, England, in the county of Nottinghamshire, near a village called Norton Disney, a team of archaeologists carefully removed layers of ancient soil and found something that none of them were fully prepared for. A Roman dodecahedron sitting undisturbed in the ground, preserved in extraordinary condition, surrounded by objects that would raise more questions than the discovery itself. What made this find so significant was not simply the object itself, but the context in which it was found. Because in archaeology, context is everything, and a sealed archaeological context, meaning a site that has remained undisturbed since the moment it was buried, tells a story that a museum display case never can. The dodecahedron at Norton Disney was found alongside pottery fragments and ancient coins, objects that allowed researchers to date the burial with reasonable confidence. And the combination of these items suggested that someone had deliberately placed them together in the ground, not carelessly discarded them, but intentionally arranged them as part of a deliberate act. The condition of the object itself was remarkable, showing no signs of wear, no scratches from repeated handling, no heat damage, no residue from candles or tools, and none of the surface deterioration you would expect from an object used regularly over a long period of time, which immediately created a significant problem for every practical theory that researchers had previously proposed. If the dodecahedron was a candle holder, it would show soot damage. If it was a knitting tool, it would show thread wear. If it was a surveying instrument or a military device of any kind, it would carry the marks of field use. But this object carried none of those marks. Arriving from the ground in a condition that suggested it had been buried shortly after it was made, or at the very least long before it had the opportunity to be used in any practical capacity. Someone had placed it in the earth carefully and deliberately alongside chosen objects and had never come back for it. That detail is the one that stays with you because people do not bury valuable, precisely crafted bronze objects music and simply forget about them. Which means either the person who buried it could not return or the burial itself was the entire point, a permanent act rather than a temporary hiding place. And when researchers began mapping every known location where a dodecahedron had ever been found, the pattern that emerged across the landscape of Roman Europe was so unexpected and so specific that it forced an entirely new conversation about what these objects might actually represent. Why every explanation collapsed. For centuries, some of the most respected historians, archaeologists, and classical scholars in the world have looked at the Roman dodecahedron and tried to explain it. And for centuries, every single explanation they have offered has eventually fallen apart under scrutiny, leaving the object sitting in its museum case, still silent, still unexplained, still waiting. The earliest and most straightforward suggestion was that the dodecahedron served as a candle holder, with the circular holes allowing light to pass through the bronze frame and create decorative patterns on surrounding surfaces. And while this sounds plausible at first, the physical evidence makes it impossible to sustain, because not one of the more than 130 known examples shows any trace of soot, heat discoloration, or wax residue on its inner surfaces. And an object used repeatedly to hold burning candles would carry all three. The knitting theory proved equally fragile with some researchers, suggesting that the holes and knobs could be used to measure and wind wool for glove making, a theory that even inspired modern knitters to attempt recreating the process. Yet no textile fibers have ever been found on any dodecahedron, and the irregular hole sizes make consistent knitting patterns functionally impossible to produce. Coin testers, surveying tools, military rangefinders, and astronomical instruments were all proposed in turn, and each theory arrived with genuine enthusiasm and careful reasoning, only to collapse when researchers asked the same simple question, which was, where is the standardization? Because every practical Roman tool was built to a consistent specification, so that it could be used reliably and repeatedly. And the dodecahedrons, with their irregular dimensions and non-matching holes, cannot function as a reliable measuring or calibration device of any kind. The sundial theory perhaps lasted longest, with some scholars producing convincing geometric arguments for how the holes could align with sunlight at specific times of year. But the fatal problem remains unchanged, because a sundial requires consistent dimensions to function accurately, and no two dodecahedrons share the same measurements. What all of these theories share, beyond their individual weaknesses, is a common assumption. And that assumption is that the dodecahedron was built for the ordinary world, for domestic music, life, for military use, for trade, for measurement, for the practical rhythms of daily Roman existence. Music, and it is that assumption itself that may be the fundamental error. Because if this object was not built for ordinary life, then the question changes entirely, and the answer may be hiding not in Roman workshops or military manuals, but in the places where these objects were actually music found. And those locations tell a story that nobody in Rome ever wanted written down. The map nobody wanted to see. When researchers began plotting the discovery locations of every known Roman dodecahedron onto a map of the former Roman Empire, what they expected to find was a distribution pattern consistent with Roman civilization at its most developed and densely populated. Objects turning up near major cities, administrative centers, military headquarters, and wealthy urban provinces where skilled craftsmen and expensive materials would naturally concentrate. What they found instead was the precise opposite, and the pattern was so clear and so consistent that it was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Dodecahedrons have been found in Gaul, in Germania, and in Britannia, regions that sat at the outermost edges of Roman territorial control, the frontier zones where Roman authority was newest, thinnest, and most aggressively contested. And not a single confirmed example has ever been recovered from the city of Rome itself, from Italy, from the wealthy eastern provinces, or from any of the major administrative centers where Roman power was oldest and most deeply established. The empire's heartland, the place where Roman culture was born and most fully expressed, produced none of these objects, while the empire's edges, the places where Roman soldiers and officials pushed into territories with deep and ancient non-Roman traditions, produced almost all of them. The geographic pattern becomes even more specific when you examine the precise, fine spots within those frontier regions, because a significant number of dodecahedrons were recovered not from Roman settlements or military forts, but from locations that held particular significance in pre-Roman Celtic tradition, near rivers, near wells, near the boundaries of ancient forests, and near burial grounds. Places that Celtic cultures across Europe consistently understood as liminal spaces, meaning thresholds between the world of the living and whatever they believed existed beyond it. These were not random discard sites or casual lost locations, but places where objects were deliberately placed in relationship to the landscape itself. And that deliberate placement connects the dodecahedrons not to Roman administrative practice, but to something far older and far less comfortable for an empire that publicly positioned itself as the rational, ordered, civilized alternative to what it called barbarian superstition. The objects were clustering around the spiritual geography of the people Rome had conquered, and that pattern combined with the complete silence in every Roman official record begins to suggest something that the empire would have had very strong reasons to suppress. The fact that there aren't any writings or art with it in there is a clue. Like lack of information is a clue. Like why didn't they talk about these things? What those reasons were, and how far Rome was willing to go to enforce that silence is written into the legal history of the empire itself. And the laws Rome passed against certain kinds of knowledge are some of the most revealing documents the ancient world ever produced. Snorts Rome's war against forbidden rituals. Rome liked to present itself to the world as a civilization built on reason, law, and order. A rational empire that replaced chaos with structure and superstition with organized religion. And for the most part, the story it told about itself was convincing enough that much of the ancient world accepted it, and much of the modern world has repeated it ever since. Beneath that carefully maintained image was a deep and persistent fear, and that fear was not of foreign armies or economic collapse or political instability, but of spiritual power that existed outside Roman control. Power that Rome could not tax, could not regulate, could not absorb into its official religious framework, and could not fully destroy, no matter how many laws it passed or how many sacred sites it burned to the ground. Rome passed a series of laws specifically targeting magic, divination, and necromancy, with the Lex Cornelia de Sicarias et Beneficiis being among the most significant. A piece of legislation that made the practice of certain ritual arts punishable by death, exile, or the confiscation of all property. And the very existence of such a law tells you something important, because empires do not write laws against things that do not exist or do not threaten them. The Druids presented perhaps the most direct challenge to Roman spiritual authority across the frontier regions, serving as priests, judges, astronomers, and keepers of tribal memory across Celtic society in Gaul and Britannia, holding a form of influence over their communities that Rome found deeply threatening, because it operated completely outside Roman institutional control and carried a legitimacy that Roman officials could not simply override by decree. Rome's response was systematic and brutal, with Roman forces under Suetonius Paulinus launching a deliberate campaign against the Druidic stronghold on the island of Anglesey off the coast of Wales, destroying sacred groves, killing priests, and attempting to erase the institutional knowledge that the Druidic tradition carried in what amounted to a calculated act of cultural destruction, rather than a conventional military engagement. Now, hold all of that history in your mind and place it alongside everything the dodecahedrons have already revealed: the secret burials, the frontier locations, the complete absence from Roman records, the lack of any official stamp or inscription, the Celtic geographic clustering, and the deliberate placement near rivers and graves and forest boundaries, and a coherent and deeply unsettling picture begins to take shape. If possessing one of these objects was connected to ritual practices that Rome had criminalized, then the silence in Roman records is not mysterious at all, because you do not write official documents about forbidden things, and you do not leave your name attached to objects that could place you on the wrong side of an imperial law carrying the death penalty. The people who used these objects had every reason to hide them and every reason to never speak of them. But hidden inside the objects themselves was evidence that no amount of silence could erase. And when modern science finally looked closely enough, what it found would change everything. Researchers thought they understood about what these objects were actually for. Snorts the laboratory results that changed everything. For most of the history of Roman dodecahedron research, the debate had taken place almost entirely in the realm of theory, with historians and archaeologists examining the objects visually, measuring their dimensions, mapping their locations, and constructing arguments based on what the objects looked like and where they had been found. But what nobody had done with sufficient scientific rigor until relatively recently was look inside them, not with the eye, but with the instruments of modern forensic chemistry. When researchers finally subjected a selection of dodecahedrons to mass spectrometry and isotope analysis, two of the most precise analytical tools available to modern science, music, they were not entirely sure what they expected to find. Perhaps traces of metal polish, perhaps organic residue from soil contact during burial, perhaps nothing of significance at all. But what the laboratory results actually showed stopped the research team completely. Inside the hollow bronze chambers, preserved across nearly 2,000 years of burial, were traces of stearic acid, which is a fatty compound produced by the burning of animal or human tissue, alongside pine resin, which was used extensively in ancient ritual contexts as a fragrant accelerant and purifying agent, and lavender oil, a substance with deep associations across multiple ancient cultures with funeral rites, spiritual cleansing, and the preparation of the dead. Each of those substances individually might have carried an innocent explanation, since ancient people used pine resin for many practical purposes, and lavender oil had domestic applications beyond the ritual. But the combination of all three together inside a sealed hollow bronze object immediately suggested something far more specific than ordinary domestic use, pointing toward a deliberate and structured burning process, rather than accidental contamination or casual household activity. And then the analysis revealed something else, something that the researchers described in their notes with a restraint that barely concealed the weight of what they were looking at. Because the isotope signatures inside the chamber were not consistent with animal bone alone, but carried markers consistent with cremated human remains, meaning that at some point, human bone had been deliberately burned inside or in direct connection with this object. The team ruled out contamination through a careful examination of the isotope ratios, which indicated material that had been subjected to the high temperatures of deliberate cremation, rather than the slow, organic decomposition of accidental contact. And the consistency of the residue distribution inside the chamber suggested it had been placed there intentionally, rather than introduced through environmental exposure during burial. What the laboratory had uncovered was not a candle holder, not a knitting tool, not a surveying instrument, snorts, but an object that had been used in direct contact with human remains during what appeared to be a structured burning ritual. And that discovery demanded an entirely new framework for understanding not just what the dodecahedron was, but what it was designed to do. And the answer to that question lay in the geometry of the object itself, the device that released the dead. Once the laboratory results had established that human remains had been burned in connection with the dodecahedron, researchers turned their attention back to the physical object itself with entirely fresh eyes, because now the question was no longer simply what this thing was, but how it worked. And the answer was encoded in the geometry that everyone had been staring at for centuries, without fully understand what they were seeing. The 12 pentagonal faces of the dodecahedron are each pierced by a circular hole, and those holes vary in diameter from one face to the next in a pattern that is not random. Because while no two dodecahedrons are identical to each other, within each individual object, the varying hole sizes create a specific and functional relationship between air flow, heat distribution, and the direction in which smoke is released from the interior chamber. A hollow bronze object with holes of different sizes placed over a burning material does not simply fill with smoke and release it uniformly in all directions. So it's 12 music sides, and the interesting thing about this is there's these holes in it. And all these holes are different sizes, but instead creates a system of differential pressure, drawing oxygen in through the larger openings and directing smoke outward through the smaller ones in concentrated streams, meaning that the person using the object could control the direction and intensity of the smoke emerging from it by rotating the dodecahedron and choosing which face to orient toward the ritual space. The 20 knobs at the vertices, which researchers had long struggled to explain in purely decorative or functional terms, now revealed their purpose with sudden clarity because they act as legs and stabilizing points that elevate the object above the surface it rests on, allowing air to circulate beneath the bronze chamber and feed the burning material inside with a consistent oxygen supply, which is precisely what you need if you want to sustain a slow, controlled burn rather than a rapid open fire. Reconstruct the ritual setting that the physical evidence now suggests, and what emerges is a scene of considerable deliberate atmosphere. A dark and enclosed room, a controlled fire burning within the bronze chamber, smoke carrying the residue of human remains and pine resin and lavender oil escaping through the geometric pentagonal openings in concentrated streams, casting moving shadows shaped like pentagons across the walls and ceiling of the space. While the participants in whatever ceremony was taking place breathed air that carried, in the most literal chemical sense, the physical substance of the dead. The idea that participants may have deliberately inhaled smoke containing the remains of the deceased as a form of communion with the dead sits at the center of what researchers now describe as the necromantic interpretation of the dodecahedron, a theory suggesting that these objects were designed to dissolve the boundary between the living and the dead in the most direct and physical way imaginable, allowing the community to breathe the dead back into themselves as part of a structured ritual of remembrance or communication. It is a deeply strange idea to a modern mind, but it is entirely consistent with what Celtic funerary tradition across the frontier regions of the Roman world valued most, which was the maintenance of connection with ancestors. And it raises one final question that changes the entire story, because if the Celts created these objects for their own spiritual purposes, then the assumption that has underpinned every theory for centuries may be wrong from the very first word. The secret Rome never admitted. From the moment the Roman dodecahedron entered the archaeological record, the assumption embedded in its very name shaped every conversation about it. And that assumption is simple and seemingly obvious, which is that an object found across the Roman Empire made of bronze, recovered from Roman-era burial contexts, must therefore be a Roman invention serving some Roman purpose that history has simply forgotten to record. The forensic analysis that revealed human remains inside the objects also opened a parallel investigation into the bronze itself. And what the metallurgical examination revealed was not consistent with standard Roman bronze production, which followed well-documented alloy specifications that Roman foundries applied consistently across the empire to ensure reliability and standardization. The trace element profiles of multiple dodecahedrons showed compositional signatures that aligned far more closely with older Celtic metallurgical traditions than with Roman imperial production methods, with specific ratios of tin, lead, and trace impurities matching the fingerprint of music, pre-Roman Celtic bronze working in the frontier regions, rather than the controlled alloy blends that Roman state foundries reliably produced. Roman engineering was built on standardization, with every component of Roman infrastructure and manufactured goods following consistent specifications that could be replicated identically, whether you were in Rome or on the edge of the known world. And that standardization is precisely what is absent from every single dodecahedron ever recovered. Each unique in its dimensions, its whole sizes, and its geometry in ways that suggest individual craft production rather than centralized imperial manufacturing. The geometry itself carries a final piece of evidence because the symbolic use of 12 pentagonal faces had deep music, roots in Celtic sacred numerology and cosmological thinking, appearing repeatedly in Celtic ritual contexts, with no parallel in Roman official religion or Roman mathematical tradition, suggesting the form was inherited from a much older symbolic framework that predated Roman presence in the frontier regions by centuries. Place all of this together, and a conclusion begins to form that is more uncomfortable than any previous theory, because it suggests that Rome did not invent the dodecahedron at all, but instead encountered it in the territories it conquered, recognized it as an object of significant ritual power, and chose to erase all record of it rather than acknowledge what it represented. The silence in Roman records was not an accident of history, and the Norton Disney burial may hold the final piece of the answer. What was buried beneath the empire? If you return now to that quiet field in Lincolnshire, to the sealed pit, to the pottery and coins arranged with deliberate care around a bronze object in extraordinary condition, and look at it again with everything you now know. Because the Norton Disney dodecahedron looks completely different once you understand what it may actually be. For decades, researchers described that burial as Roman, cataloged it as Roman, and filed it under the long list of Roman mysteries that archaeology had not yet solved. But if the metallurgical analysis is correct, if the geometry points to Celtic sacred tradition rather than Roman utility, and if the ritual residue inside points to a funeral practice that Rome had criminalized and actively suppressed, then what was buried in that Lincolnshire field was not a Roman object at all. It was a means for survival. Someone carried that object to that field knowing exactly what it was and what it represented, arranged it carefully in the ground alongside objects that marked it as significant, and covered it over in an act that looks far less like disposal and far more like protection. The deliberate preservation of something that could not be displayed openly, could not be passed down through normal means, and could not be allowed to fall into the hands of the authority that had spent generations trying to erase the tradition it belonged to. How many more were destroyed before they could be hidden, melted down by Roman officials who understood exactly what they were looking at, even as they ensured that no written record would ever confirm it, is a question that archaeology cannot currently answer and may never be able to answer fully. How many more remain in the soil of Britain, Gaul, and Germania, near forgotten ritual sites that no excavation has yet reached, is a question that every new season of fieldwork brings closer to resolution, one careful brushstroke at a time. What the Roman dodecahedron ultimately reveals is not a gap in Roman knowledge, but a deliberate wound in human memory. The place where an empire erased a rival culture's most sacred technology, and then buried the silence so completely that it took modern chemistry to hear what had been suppressed. The object Rome never admitted existed may be the most honest thing the ancient world left behind. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.